Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's presentations, Iconography of the Mother of God. On behalf of the Knights of Columbus Museum, thank you for joining this session, which is one of a weekly online series for the benefit of museum patrons. This presentation is being video recorded and will be available for viewing via the museum's YouTube channel. An email message will be sent tomorrow to all registrants with video links and information about next week's topic, Pisanki, the Art of Eggs, with Father Paul Ligneau. A few notes before we begin this afternoon's presentation. The Knights of Columbus Museum remains closed while we wait and pray for the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. For information about the museum and its upcoming events and offerings, visit kofcmuseum.org or follow the museum on social media channels at KOFC Museum. There is a list from our presenter of suggestions for further reading and study on today's topic that may be downloaded from the handout section. You may submit questions at any point during the presentation using the questions utility. I'll monitor activity throughout the presentation and can respond privately to anyone experiencing technical issues. I'll address a selection of your questions to our presenter in a question and answer session following his talk, which should last approximately 40 minutes. Throughout its 20 years in its current location, the Knights of Columbus Museum has hosted or curated several exhibitions of iconography and Marian art. Inasmuch as this is the first presentation of this sort during the month of May, the month in Catholic tradition dedicated to the Blessed Virgin, and also the National Day of Prayer in the United States, it's a joy to welcome Marek Czarnecki to present today's webinar. Marek has lectured in person multiple times at the Knights of Columbus Museum, always to large numbers and always to the attendees' delight. A Connecticut native, Marek studied under Russian iconographer Senya Pokrovsky, who founded the Isograph School in Moscow. In recognition of his iconography and liturgical restoration work, Marek received the 1996 and 2004 Artists Fellowship from the Connecticut Commission on Arts. He is also the recipient of the American Council for Polish Culture's Jan de Rosen Award and has been recognized by the National Endowment for the Arts through the Southern New England Traditional Arts Program. Marek's icons may be found in homes, chapels, and churches across the United States, including the Franciscan University of Steubenville and the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Springfield, Illinois. Locally in Connecticut, his art is in Quinnipiac University's Catholic Chapel and the St. Thomas More Chapel at Yale University. Marek and his work have been featured in numerous articles, exhibitions, and video productions. His studio, Seraphic Restorations, is in Meriden, Connecticut. Marek, I turn the session over to you, and I will return for questions at your conclusion.
Okay, great. All right, can you see my screen, Peter? Okay, well, let me start then. Before I start talking about the images of the Mother of God, I just wanted to say something about the context of icons in the West. It's a very hopeful sign that people who aren't Eastern Orthodox are interested in icons. It's from the ecumenism of the Second Vatican Council. Something that I love about my work is that it talks about a time when there was only one united church. Before there were schisms, before there were reformations, there was one church that spoke with one voice. And one of those tools that we used was iconography, and that we can meet together on the same platform when still so many things tear us apart. But we also need to bow in gratitude to the Eastern Orthodox Church for preserving this holy art in its integrity. The icons I'll be sharing with you today show the history of the Mother of God from that one individual Miriam of Nazareth to the multiplicity of icons that we find all over the world, even icons that look like they couldn't possibly be of the same person. How did that happen? In his letter to artists, Pope John Paul also said, anybody who's interested in being a religious artist, look at icons, return to those roots. And in keeping with his request, I wanted to return to the apostolic simplicity of the first Christians and the stories of how iconography began and the earliest icons of the Mother of God. And I like to look at it through two different lenses, and the first is through the lens of Holy Tradition and the stories connected with icons. It's very different than the kinds of historical facts that we'll receive from archaeology, but still there's an enormous amount of important information that we need to look at in these legends. And inside of these legends are some historical truths that are really worthwhile exploring. This is a very beautiful icon from Pskov in Russia. And it shows St. Luke painting the first icon of the Mother of God. The legend is that while she was still alive, she sat for this portrait and blessed it and said, "My grace goes with this image." You know what's interesting about that legend is that we know that St. Luke wrote that gospel that contains the most information about the intimate lives of Jesus and Mary. And I had to ask a friend of mine who's a Baptist Bible teacher for an unbiased opinion, how come? And she told me what I had heard before, that she either told it to him firsthand, or it was kept alive by a community of people who were around her as an oral tradition. But her opinion was that somehow it was firsthand accounting. So whether he wrote the gospel or painted it, it's about his firsthand connection with that one real historical person. But something else that it connects us to is that as icon painters, we've all heard that kind of awkward phrasing that we write icons or paint icons. We can see we paint icons, that's fine. But poetically and metaphorically, we also write icons, because what we're creating is not just an image, but a dogmatic text. And for us, there's absolutely no separation between the written text and the image. Here's a beautiful Byzantine gospel book that shows an icon of the deposition with the text that describes it. And as iconographers, we also have to be very reserved on top of being responsible. We can't add one word or one letter to what's there in the text. And a lot of the examples I'll show you, you'll see that it's just absolutely every word from that biblical text is in there without anything extra added to it. So whether Luke painted an icon of the Mother of God or wrote about her in a book for us as iconographers, there's really no difference. But something else that's interesting, a detail that could connect him to that legend, is that most of the followers of Christ were Jews. And they had been instilled so long with that commandment of make no images of me, they would never have dared to make a painting. But archaeologists have shown us synagogues in Greek communities that were decorated with paintings, even though they were Jews and also had heard the same prescriptions. So if anybody would have, Luke would have been more culturally comfortable making an icon of Mary than any of the other followers. And I also want you to remember, that phenomenon of literacy is very new. In my own family, it only goes back 3 generations. And this is how you would learn and read your Bible stories. That we've all heard this phrase that icons are the Bibles of the poor. They are, but who's not poor? And the church was always confronted with this problem. How do we teach the stories of the gospel and the lives of the saints if people can't read? If they can't read that written text, we have to use pictures. Today, in the world, there are probably about 20-something icons that say that they are painted by St. Luke. It doesn't stand up to the rigors of testing, but I still want to show you some of them because when you encounter them, you'll hear that legend. And again, that legend is very important because it tells us about the meaning of icons, that the Mother of God was a real human being that somebody knew personally. And the other issue with icons of the Mother of God is there are no relics of her. There is no site. Imagine having a family member die and there's no grave to visit, there's no body to see. So the icons of the Mother of God acquired the importance of relics and of places where people could encounter her because they couldn't in other ways. This is a icon of the Mother of God that's at St. Mary Major's in Rome. She's called the Savior of the Roman people. When there was a plague, the icon was taken in procession, and afterwards the plague abated. It is a very old icon, and it's been beautifully restored just within the past year. And it shows the Mother of God holding the Christ child. It's been dated to about the 6th century. Another icon connected with the authorship of St. Luke is this icon of the Mother of God of Tikhvin. It's a very famous icon in Russia that actually was in Chicago for a period of time to protect it from the Soviets and was eventually returned. But it's been dated to the 13th century. And perhaps one of the most famous icons that's connected with that Lucan authorship is the icon of Our Lady of Częstochowa. This icon has a very, very complicated history. That's the subject for another lecture. When the icon was desecrated, it wasn't just scratched, but smashed into pieces. And the boards were considered holy relics because the legend is that they actually came from the house of Nazareth, that St. Joseph had made them, the table that they ate off of, and that was where the icon was painted from. So when the icon was smashed, the boards were rejoined and the icon was repainted by Gothic artists in the much later. I've read the book about the current conservator who's taking care of this icon, and through x-rays, he said that he's found on the broken boards 3 very, very small scraps of the original icon, but they're buried under so many layers of paint, they're impossible to access. But they've dated the boards, and they also know that that icon has been dated much later to the medieval times. Archaeology tells us a very different story about the first images of the Mother of God. And the image I have on the left is from the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome. And it's the earliest image we have found so far of the Mother of God. It doesn't mean that there aren't others that we haven't found. And I'm constantly reading about archaeologists that are discovering more and finding more, but they haven't been defended. So let's just use this one for now as our placekeeper. And it's dated from 177 to 300. And it shows us the Mother of God nursing the Christ child. And next to her stands a prophet who points to a star. Often I've read that it's interpreted as the prophet Barlaam, who wrote in his prophecy, "A star shall rise from David." And in this very modest kind of rushed fresco, we can see an awful lot about the early Christian community and its attitudes towards Mary. First, that she was already respected and venerated. But something else I really like about this image, put yourself in the place of those early Christians. It's a crime to believe what you do, and you're physically underground, right? Their churches and cemeteries were all underground. And they just did what they could with what they had. And it's why these things were hidden. Something else that the early Christians did that's very fascinating is that regardless of what culture or country or civilization that they were in, they recognized in the pagan art and pagan theology things that overlapped with Christian belief. On the right-hand side, I have a statue of a goddess. It could be, I read that it was Isis, but to me, I think it's Demeter. And in these pagan images, they saw some kind of connection of divine maternity that they felt was also very Marian. And but they didn't accept the other aspects of it that contradicted Christian thinking. So we can say that they accepted pagan images and baptized them and absorbed them. It's a fascinating time of art to study because oftentimes it's very difficult to discern, is it Christian or is it pagan? Is it the Good Shepherd? Is it Orpheus? If you were inside of Christianity, inside that cult, you could read the signs and understand it. And outside it would be confusing, which is exactly what they wanted, only for people who were inside to understand it. And the Christians, it wasn't just the Jews who received prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. It was the whole world. And wherever those early Christian communities saw those same kinds of premonitions, they absorbed it and put it into their own artwork. These are historically some of the oldest icons of the Mother of God. And it's very difficult for me to show you a lot of them because they were almost all successfully destroyed. In the 8th century, it was one of the great crises in church history called iconoclasm. And it was a debate about whether or not images were idols and whether or not they had a place in the church. The early Christians just made them. It was just a spontaneous reaction to their faith and what they felt they needed. And these are some of those early pre-iconoclastic icons. What's interesting is a lot of those earliest icons are either in Rome or Mount Sinai. And it's because iconoclasm never reached the Western Church. And the Mount Sinai was outside of the Byzantine Empire. So they were sent both to those two sites for preservation. And the icon on the left is kept at Mount Sinai. The right is now in St. Petersburg. And what we can see in these early icons is they've absorbed the classical style of art. We don't know a lot about ancient painting. We know more about their sculpture. And they're painted in wax. They used what they had to make their artwork, but the earliest icons were painted in encaustic or wax. These are two of those Roman Madonnas that also are early. The one on the left is probably pre-iconoclastic, and the one is either during or a little bit after. One of the big problems of the early church was because communities were all scattered and hidden, there was no consistency of belief or dogma. And once Christianity was decriminalized by Constantine, well, one of the first things he needed to do was organize all of that into dogma. And this is a fresco from Greece of the First Ecumenical Council with Constantine in the center. And one of the big problems of the first, the Ecumenical Council that they tried to resolve first is we read all of these things about Jesus, but really, who is he? And not only who is he, but what is he? People thought that maybe he was just a very good philosopher, or other people thought he was a magician. There was another sect that believed he didn't have a body, he was just a ghost. And the First Ecumenical Council resolved, after very much debate, that Jesus Christ is 100% human and 100% divine without any contradiction from the beginning of his conception. And again, the church is faced with an issue. How do we teach this now? One of the things that's very special and unique about iconography that's different than all other types of religious art is iconography has found a way to show both worlds. Every Sunday, we say the creed, we say, I believe in all things visible and invisible. Most religious art just shows the visible reality of things, but iconography found a way to point to the invisible parts. And in this icon, we see the real portrait of Christ. How we arrived at this as the recognizable portrait, that's subject for another lecture. And that's his human, that 100% of him is human. But behind him, we see that very simple symbol of a halo. That was an artistic device that was borrowed from pagan art. And it was to show that that person was filled with light and divine. And to teach his divinity, inside of Christ's halo was inscribed this 3-bar cross with 3 Greek characters that are the first 3 letters for the phrase, I am who am. It's how God named himself to Moses, how he declared himself to Moses. So just by combining that portrait with those semantic signs, we can show and represent both his humanity and divinity in a way that all other types of art can't. And through that combination, we can show what he himself taught, which is I and the Father are one. This is an amazing mosaic I just found yesterday that's of the Council of Ephesus. Once it was resolved on the nature of Jesus, there was a question, then who was Mary? Because a lot of speculative ideas had grown up around her, superstitions, inordinate worship. Some people thought she was like those ancient mother goddesses. And a council needed to be called to resolve all of those issues. And this is a mosaic that I found. It's in Fouvier, France. Shows that council. And the resolution of the council was that the Virgin Mary was a human being, completely human. And by her human will, and then somehow by the grace of God, she was prepared to give birth to Jesus, who's God, the second person of the Trinity. And the first title that was awarded to her was in Greek Theotokos, or the Mother of God, she who bore God. They were debating whether or not they should say Christotokos, but to say she was just the mother of his human nature would have been to put up some kind of a board, a division in between his human and divine nature from the instant of his conception, when it was always integral. And the Virgin Mary is the mother of God, the second person of the Trinity, but no one can be the mother of God of the first person of the Trinity. And at that declaration, again, an image was needed to be created to explain and understand that. And I'm going to show you a few of the great models for icons of the Mother of God. This is one of them, and it's called the icon of Our Lady of Yaroslav. It's also called Our Lady of the Sign, from the prophecy of Isaiah, where he said, you know, I give you the sign, a virgin will be bear a child, and his name will be Emmanuel. And what we're looking at is an image of the Mother of God's pregnancy. She's opening up to show us that child inside of her, but it's not an image of biological pregnancy. It's an image of him inside of her, and it's not a typical baby because it's dressed in very aristocratic garments. And we can tell by that semantic sign of the halo with the cross inside of it that this is Jesus Christ, whom the prophet calls Emmanuel. And the Mother of God is in a position of prayer. Another dogma connected to the Mother of God that was defined was her perpetual virginity. And to show this on an icon, and this is absolutely unique and specific and essential for every icon of the Mother of God, that there are 3 stars, one on each shoulder and one on her forehead, to show that she is Mother of God before, during, and after the birth of Christ. And again, that's something invisible, right? That state of grace is a conversation between her soul and God's, and there's no way we can possibly paint it. So what we can do is we can point at it with signs and symbols. There are 3 basic types of icons that show us the Mother of God. That title is also very important. In the East, you will almost never hear her called Mary or Virgin Mary, but Mother of God. And that appellation also infers a relationship. And it's very, very unusual to find icons of the Virgin Mary by herself. They're usually cut out of other icons or from different ensembles. It doesn't mean that there aren't any. There's always exceptions to it, but almost always you'll see the Mother of God with the Christ child or an icon that infers her relationship with the Christ child. This was to take attention away from her, from the people who thought she was a goddess, and onto her child. And the icon I'm showing you here is one of the most famous and beautiful icons that have ever been painted. And it's the Eloisa type. It's the Greek word that means tenderness or loving or merciful. And it's an icon that came from Constantinople and was brought to Russia. It's an early Byzantine icon, and it shows the Mother of God in a very intimate moment. She's playing with her child. And these types of icons of Our Lady of Tenderness They feel very warm and they're very accessible. Some of them are just amazingly playful, almost the chaotic child, but they show a very, very private side and a very human side of both the mother and the child. The second form that I'd like to introduce you to for icons of the Mother of God is called Hodegetria in Greek, or translated to She Who Shows the Way, or the Directress. This is a really lovely Cretan icon. What I love about Cretan and Greek icons is how clear they are. There's no ambiguity about them. And we see the Mother of God frontally holding the Christ child, her son. And it's a very formal pose, like she's presenting him to you. And she points away from herself to him, She Who Shows the Way, and then he responds by blessing. What's interesting about all of those Lucan icons is that they're all of that one prototype of the Hodegetria. And it could have been that if he made an icon like that, I'm not saying he didn't, it could have been destroyed during that time of iconoclasm, especially if it garnered a lot of attention and the enthusiasm of the desecrators. The third form of all icons of the Mother of God is the one I showed you before of Our Lady of the Sign, where she's praying. It's oranta, or in Greek platitera, which means more spacious than the heavens. And we see the Christ child inside of her, fully clothed and with her hands out to the side praying. As the church endorsed the veneration of the Mother of God, there was the necessity too to talk about her life and to tell her biography and what part she played in the life of Jesus and the events of the Bible. When the church consolidated all of those canonical books, there was this whole body of other books that it decided to keep as worthy of your study. And some were more worthy and others were less worthy. Some of them are just absolutely bizarre. One of those books that was kept very close but not accepted into the canonical Bible was called the Book of James, or the Proto-Evangelium of James. And I encourage you all to read it. It's not very long and it's accessible on the internet. And in this icon, we see St. James leading the donkey as the Holy Family leaves to Egypt. The earliest tradition is that St. Joseph was a widower and that he had other children before he was engaged to the Mother of God. And since St. Luke was the elder brother of Christ from that other marriage, he witnessed and was able to record not only the early events of Christ's infancy, but also the events of his mother's life. And it's from the Proto-Evangelium of James that we learn of the names of the parents of the Mother of God, Anna and Joachim. And this is a very beautiful contemporary icon of the two embracing. Their names are not listed in the scripture. It comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James. And they were an elderly sterile couple who had a problem conceiving. Joachim was kicked out when he went to pay his yearly tithes because it was considered an act that he was unclean if God didn't bless him with a child. And both he and Anna received messages from angels that they would conceive. And this is an icon of the two of them embracing. And the icon has two titles. It could be the meeting of Saints Joachim and Anna, or also the icon of the conception of the Virgin Mary. And Saint Anne miraculously conceived. And I love this icon. It's from a Serbian monastery. One of the biases I think people have against iconography is that they feel it's cold or it's impersonal. Look at this icon. There's nothing cold about it. Look at the look on Saint Anne's face. She's really in labor. And then on one side, midwives washing the infant Mary, and on the other side, Saint Joachim visiting with her. This is another beautiful fresco that shows the first steps of the Mother of God. It's very tender and very intimate. And this is an icon of just Saint Anne with the Mother of God. And what I love about it, it's a very well-known icon, is the iconographer was making a parallel between that other icon, the Hodegetria, where the Mother of God holds the Christ child. Well, Mary herself was a child, and it's a parallel pose that she takes when she has her own son. The next event that we see the Mother of God in her own life is in the Proto-Evangelium, and it's the presentation of the Virgin in the temple, where her parents, in gratitude for having a child, dedicate her and bring her to the temple when she was 3 years old. And the Proto-Evangelium says that she ran up the steps by herself and lived in the temple. And on the upper right-hand side of the icon, we see the Mother of God in the temple being fed by angels. This is a very interesting mosaic from Constantinople. And it's an icon of the betrothal of the Mother of God to Saint Joseph. And again, the legend is that he was an elder. You know, in Polish, we sing Christmas carols where we still call him Old Joseph. And the early legend is that he was selected among a group of suitors who had placed their staffs on the altar, and Saint Joseph's staff blossomed into flowers. And it's why in Catholic iconography, you always see Saint Joseph holding that stalk with lilies on it. It actually comes from the Proto-Evangelium. Here's their betrothal, and Saint Joseph takes her into his home. This is an icon, a very, very typical icon of the prototype for the Nativity. And it's very different than the kinds of nativity scenes we're used to seeing. And it shows you something that an icon can do that other kinds of artwork can't, and how we enter into the piece. As an icon, it would be more difficult through representational art to do that. In the center, we see the Christ child being born in a cave with the animals, and I want you to remember that Christ child because we'll be coming back to him later. We see the very literal stories. The gospel has taken up now where the Apocrypha of James has stopped. So we see that biblical event, but we still have two little episodes at the bottom that are not in the gospel, but in the Apocrypha that help us get inside of this icon. And on one side, you have midwives watching the Christ child and Saint Joseph, and the midwives are talking amongst themselves, and one is saying to the other, "Do you really believe that story she told you?" And the shepherd, sometimes that one in profile is interpreted as the devil, because you never see people in profile in icons, and that he is tempting Saint Joseph with the same thing. Really? You really think that's what happened? And you know, it lets us to go inside of the icon to have those doubts ourselves, to process that story, and to consent to it. And it's something that other types of religious art wouldn't give us the permission to do. The next event from the Gospels is the presentation of the Lord in the temple. This is one of the last icons where you see Saint Joseph. In the Eastern Church, Saint Joseph is only shown in icons where he plays a part in the narrative. And he's with a halo, but there is no individual feast day for him. And devotion and attention to Saint Joseph was intentionally suppressed so that the divine paternity of Christ could never be called into question. And poor Joseph suffered in silence like he did during the life of Christ. We just didn't know him for so long. Even in the Catholic Church, devotion to Saint Joseph happened very late. But we see exactly what the scripture tells us in this icon from Novgorod. And again, not one extra word. If I read that text to you, you could read, you could look at the image as I said every word and find every detail in it. To the right of that, we have a separate icon called, it's a provincial Russian icon called the Mother of God of the Seven Swords. And it articulates that prophecy of Simeon, where he told the Mother of God that, you know, he will be the rise and fall of many, but a sword of sorrow will pierce your heart. And here's an image of the Christ child over her heart with those seven swords. There's an icon that was influenced by the Western devotion of the seven sorrows of the Mother of God, but they're all based in scripture. And one of the first sorrows of the Mother of God is the losing of the Christ child. This is a Cretan fresco that shows the parents of the Jesus coming to find him in the temple. And the next episode we find her in is the wedding at Cana. And again, every single word from that scriptural account is here in this icon with nothing extra. And the iconographer had a very important responsibility, a responsibility that we still have, which is not to add our own opinions, not to add our own heresies. I tell this to my students. In our own special way, we're all heretics, but God forbid I make you sick with mine. So in the icon, we only put in what we believe and know. That's transpersonal. The next icon is the icon of the crucifixion. And again, very literal. What's interesting in this icon I wanted to point out is the calmness and the quiet of it. Most religious art only focuses on the human suffering, while iconography always points to the hope of the resurrection. So we have to, because of the narrative, show his human suffering, but we understate it. And these are two more icons in that passion cycle of the descent from the cross and also the burial of Christ. And we see, again, a parallel that the iconographers were trying to make from that nativity scene icon, that Christ child in the crib looks exactly like the Christ that's being placed in the tomb. So it's very, very deliberate. And theologically, what it can show us is that from the instant of his birth, his mission was already established, that he would be dying. And here's two icons that show that very deliberate parallel. The Mother of God kissing the Christ child, and on the other side, burying him. There's a very important icon that's brought out only on Good Friday called Mother, Do Not Weep for Me. In the Western Church, we call it the Pietà. And it shows the Mother of God grieving over Christ. But it's consistent with that optimistic tone that everything points to the resurrection, and it's as if we're looking in eternal time back on that event. You know, if you're going through something painful and know that there's going to be a good resolution, it's easier to bear that pain. And the icon is shown in that light, and even though on the physical plane, all we can see is a corpse and a grieving mother, on that other invisible plane, we have Christ telling her, please, you don't need to cry because I will rise. But it doesn't mean that the pain is hidden. It's just expressed in a very subdued way. This next icon is the Mother of God at the Ascension. And again, very, very literal to the scripture. At Pentecost. And then the final icon in the life of the Mother of God is the Dormition, or the falling asleep of the Mother of God. In the West, it's celebrated as the Feast of the Assumption. But in the East, it's the Dormition. And this is probably, for me, one of the most powerful icons that can show you the potential of what it can do that religious art can't. Religious artists can give us a very good, beautiful view of this world. But we also believe that reality isn't just this world, but this world and another world together at the same time. And this iconographer has shown us in our world, on the material plane, the corpse of the Mother of God. And we see her human family coming to grieve her. Simultaneously behind her, we see heaven opening up with Christ in the center. And the pose he's in is called Christ the Midwife. It's an interesting parallel to the other icons of maternity, right, of the Hodegitria, but now the mother and son are reversed. And instead of it being an image of just the finality of death, we see that this icon embodies an important paradox that we believe, that the day of our death is actually the day of our birth. And in his arms, we see the newborn soul of Mary being carried into heaven. I don't know if there's any other kind of art that could express those two things and also those paradoxes so seamlessly on one panel. There are icons of the Assumption of the Virgin, but usually it's part of a larger scene. And this is the top part of an icon of the Dormition that shows the gates of heaven opening up and the Mother of God dropping her belt to St. Thomas, who as usual was late and absent for the most important events. So those are all of the narrative icons of the life of the Virgin. The rest of the icons you will find of her are based on the intercession of the Mother of God. This is a beautiful Cretan icon that shows Mother of God and St. John the Baptist in prayer before him, and an icon of the Mother of God beseeching and praying for this group of people, and she has a list of their petitions in front of her. And another very important icon of the intercession of the Mother God is the icon of Our Lady of Protection. where she was seen over the city of Constantinople when it was under siege, and she was unwrapping and unfolding her veil of protection over the city, and the armies were repelled. This is an icon called the Mother of God, Joy of All Who Sorrow. And in this icon, the Mother of God is attending to all different people's needs. Here she's accomplishing the corporal acts of mercy. She's clothing the naked. She's feeding the hungry. And, you know, it's all of those hundreds and hundreds of different types of the Mother of God all express some specific human need or some response to a prayer that was given. This is a calendar. It's an icon of icons that catalogs all of those lists of specific splintered, separated aspects of the Mother of God. But, you know, all of those icons are variants of those three basic icons that I showed you, one or the other. And in the examples I'll show you, I've even posted which ones that they are variants of. This is a 9-part icon with 8 separate icons of the Mother of God on it. You know, by this point, it's a very strange phenomenon where it's almost like an incantation. In order for you to get what you need, you have to pray to the right Mother of God and say the right prayers. So if your prayers weren't answered, somebody would say to you, you fool, instead of going to the Mother of Smolensk, you should have prayed to the Mother of God of Three Joys. That's why your prayers weren't answered. And this is where icons start to look like Mary is a different person, that one is more powerful than the other, when really it just all points to the same historical Mother of God. Oftentimes, icons are named after the cities where the icons are enshrined or where some miracle or apparition happened. This is one of the most famous icons that have ever been painted and copied over and over. It's the Mother of God of Kazan. The icon was founded in that city, was buried. A young girl was instructed by an apparition to go unearth it, and it was replaced in the church. It's interesting to hear how many legends of miraculous icons, the icons were originally desecrated or abandoned. The icon became very, very famous and popular in Russia. She was called the Great Victory Bearer because it was carried into battle against the Polish armies. And when the battle was won, the icon was enshrined. This is an icon that every Catholic will probably recognize, called the Mother of God of Perpetual Help, right? The title comes from gratitude, right? That she always helps. And it's a Cretan icon. Originally, the prototype is called Mother of God of the Passion. And it shows her holding the Christ child, who's turning to see angels showing him the imminent instruments of his death. And the Mother of God is remembering the prophecy of Simeon. She's holding him, but she knows there's nothing she can do to stop him, and looking out at us. And I think it's a very psychologically insightful icon. And then other icons are painted for specific human needs. One of the most dangerous things that could happen to a woman is to get pregnant. And I can't remember what the statistics of mortality was, you know, in the 19th century, but it was very extreme. And this icon was made for midwives who would carry it with her. She's called the helper in childbirth. And it was carried to help alleviate the pains and dangers of childbirth. But icons are also painted for other needs that are not as important. This is the icon of the Mother of God of Increase in Reason that students would pray in front of. It's the icon I prayed in front of before I started this lecture. And another icon of the Mother of God of the Burning Bush. On the upper left-hand corner, you can see the detail of Moses looking into the burning bush. And it was a metaphor for the Mother of God that her virginity was not taken away from her, the same way that the fire did not consume the bush. And we see Moses peering into that bush and seeing the coming of the Messiah. You know, the icon became very popular for a very practical need, and that's that people's houses burned down. There's a very famous Russian academic painter who made a painting of a peasant holding out this icon in front of a fire. And, you know, at a time when there weren't any of those kinds of services that we take for granted, or medicines or antibiotics, a lot of times the only remedy you had for a crisis in your life was prayer and a miracle. And a lot of these icons testify to those particular stories. This is one of those icons from that icon of 170 icons, and it's called the Mother of God of Unexpected Joy. And it shows the Mother of God, and underneath her is a tablet telling the story of the person on the left. He's a thief. And every day before he would go out to rob people, he would kneel in front of the icon and pray for the Mother of God to protect him while he was committing his crimes. And while he's praying to her, the robes on the Christ child fell off and he saw his wounds. And often on this icon, you just have little lines, but typically the text is written on like speech balloons in a cartoon. And he's saying to her, "Oh lady, who has done this to your son?" And she answers, "You and everybody else who sins." But icons don't just appear in the past. This is a very, very famous icon right now that is multiplied. I see it everywhere. And it's called the Mother of God of the Inexhaustible Cup. It's painted by a contemporary iconographer. And when people prayed in front of it, a couple things, miracles happened. One was that people were healed from brain tumors. But more importantly, it was an icon that people used to pray with who are either drug addicts or alcoholics. And it's a rampant problem. And this is the icon that people use to ask the Mother of God to help them. And the inexhaustible cup is the cup of the chalice that Christ sits in. And the last icon I'll show you is another one of those icons that have recently appeared. Even though this icon is probably 300 years old, it has only been brought out and revealed. When an icon appears, it doesn't mean it's the first time the design has been shown to the people, but it's the first time that that icon manifests it as a site of grace. And it's an icon that's kept in Greece, and people pray for it for relief from cancer. So I'll end here. Obviously, you know, this is a subject that we can talk about forever and ever and ever. And as Peter said, I've left a reading list for people to look into if there's anything else that they want to go into deeper.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful for the presentation, an excellent talk. Marek, I'd like to ask, please, a couple of questions and would invite you to just leave that beautiful icon right there on your screen for people to view. We have a question from an attendee asking about, and I'm suspecting since you started referencing St. Luke, is there a patron saint or patron saints plural of icon artists or iconographers?
Yes, St. Luke. St. Luke. And there's a prayer that iconographers say that includes St. Luke in it. We ask for his intercession, but there's also iconographer saints that we also pray to. St. Alipy, who is the first Russian iconographer, St. Gregory of Sinai, and there's Rublev, Andrei Rublev, who painted the Trinity, was also canonized. And I would say in the West, Fra Angelico, right? Fra Angelico was also beatified. So all of those could be considered patron saints for artists.
We have an attendee from Western Canada who indicates that there is a community of iconographers in the Vancouver, British Columbia area. Are you familiar with that, group?
Yes, yeah. Iconography is a very, very big movement right now among lay people all over the world. And it's part of it is a reaction to the Second Vatican Council's removal of images. But most people just paint for their own piety.
And one of the icons that you displayed earlier, and you referenced that it was recently restored, was Salus Populi, the Roman icon that's in the Mary Major Basilica in Rome. That one, I believe, is the one selected by St. Francis, and he's been praying an invocation to that Madonna for the population not only of Rome but of the world, and he used that during his extraordinary Urbi et Orbi in March, did he not?
Yes, he did, because there's a parallel situation, right? That icon delivered the Roman people from the plague, and we're also experiencing our own epidemic. So he's returning to that ancient image where that grace was given to ask for that grace a second time.
Another attendee asks, is an icon always painted on wood?
No, no, and I intentionally showed you icons in many different formats. There were icons that were frescoes, there were icons that were mosaics, there were icons in illuminated manuscripts. They can be on panels, but it depends on the need for the icon. Icons can be embroidered and put onto vestments, and it depends on the practical need for what that icon is for.
Is there an expression in iconography of Mary being present in some form or fashion in the sacraments, and if so, to what extent?
I'm not sure I understand what that means.
The writer indicates that many Christians hold that Mary is at least in some form present in the sacraments. To what extent have icons expressed the theme that Mary is present in the sacraments, or put another way, is a mediator of sacramental graces, in particular baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist?
You know, I don't know. I don't know. I just know that she is present whenever we ask her to be. I just don't know, Peter. I don't know how to answer that.
Thank you, Marek. Is there a distinction in iconography between the sacred and liturgical art and what might be described as devotional art?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. The icons follow a very ancient way of working that was devised by generations and generations of artists who wanted to show how we can show both the physical representational world and the spiritual world. And that's done through many, many different ways. It's what makes icons very singular among religious art, that we found a way to show that material plane and also that invisible spiritual plane in one place. Whereas most religious art just shows us what things are like here and now. And, you know, the people who know me know how much I love all kinds of religious art, and I restore statues and murals. And, you know, I don't create a dichotomy or an argument among different kinds of religious art, because they're all very useful and serve a very important purpose. But icons are very, very singular in that whole context and history of religious art.
Icons, Marek, would you please explain how people who originally had access to icons avoided some form of idolatry or superstition regarding the icons, since they are so specific to particular cases and causes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the danger is to separate it from the great whole of everything. And, you know, those multiplicity of icons, to me, they look more like what we would call folk religion, you know, where actually it did become divorced. Sometimes icons could become fetishes, where people believe that the power of that grace of hearing and receiving answers to their prayers were somehow in the material of the icon. The way that it was prevented was the church coming out and defining it and saying, you know, it's a window, right? It's not the person, right? It represents the person. Somehow it's mystically connected, but I can't show you where that seam is. So it was by the church coming out and instructing people what the proper way and approach was to these images.
Marek, is there a relationship between icons such as these that show the requests of certain supplicants and ex votos and those used elsewhere in the Mediterranean world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes, if icon, an image of Mary, a lot of graces were given, people would return to give some sort of thanks. And they would bring either personal jewelry or they would bring offerings. Some of it was sold off and given as alms to the poor, but often it was melted down and made into these very elaborate covers or dresses for icons. You know, one of the best examples is Our Lady of Częstochowa. They change her dress once a year, and it's covered with thousands and thousands of pearls and diamonds. And at first, you know, when I looked at it, I thought it was odd because Mary doesn't need jewelry. And, you know, we live in this transcendent world, and the icon is much more beautiful without it. But then when I looked at it and saw that the hems of her garments were made out of hundreds of wedding rings, I realized that every single pearl, every diamond, every ring was real human life, and some real great grace that was given to people, done in gratitude. And if the Mother of God wears jewelry, it's all of the answered prayers and gratitude of the people that have prayed to her.
Are there any? This must be from an Irish viewer. Are there any icons of St. Patrick?
Oh yeah, yeah. St. Patrick was also in Orthodox iconography. He's expressed because he was a saint before the schism. But typically, you know, his devotion to St. Patrick was mostly venerated in the West. So you're most likely to find more religious art, but a lot of contemporary Irish iconographers are making icons of him. You know, if I could, I'd get up and I'd show you the one I just finished. So yeah, there are, but most of them are contemporary.
And a personal question, how were you attracted to iconography? What drew you to not only your appreciation for iconography, but also writing icons yourself?
Mm-hmm. You know, I was brought up with religious art, but they were calendar pictures that my father would cut out and frame. And it's a very weird feeling. From my earliest memory, I wanted to be an artist. And my parents are like, fine, but just remember, artists are only wealthy and famous after they're dead. So I went to art school, and I have a very good contemporary art education. But I never thought I could or would become an iconographer. That I understood was something special and a separate vocation. And then I remember seeing an icon during one of my lunch breaks in an Episcopal church and thinking, huh, people still make these? That's odd. And my father was at a parish council meeting at our parish in Bristol, and the new pastor wanted to buy an icon of Our Lady of Częstochowa for her. And he stood up and he said, don't bother. My son's an artist in New York. He'll do it for you. And called me up to give me the good news. And I was so angry at him. I knew inside I wasn't the right person to do it, but I also knew enough about icons and iconography to know that that is something very, very special. And I'm not the right person to do that kind of work. And I told him I don't want to do it. And he said, you have to. I gave them my word. And, you know, I did it, but I did it with a certain kind of distance. I was just trying to make art. I was an artist who was painting icons, not an iconographer. And I really didn't understand what I was doing until I saw people praying in front of it in church. And I felt so embarrassed. And I also saw that nothing I had ever made in my life tied together its threads or was as useful or practical to people as that one icon I made. And a friend of mine who's a priest asked me, was that your conversion experience? And I said, are you kidding? That's the first of many. And I committed myself to the work and was very, very lucky to find a remarkable teacher who taught me everything good that I know about it. So for me, it was a very natural way, even though it was a process of integrating my piety with my art. But it took a long time.
Marek, we have many more questions, but unfortunately we have no more time. So I'm very grateful. In closing, again, I extend you my thanks, not only for sharing your knowledge, but also for your esteem, your great love for this beautiful expression of sacred art. For those viewing, if you still have further questions about the session or in general, please email museum@kofc.org. The video of this session will be available on the Knights of Columbus YouTube channel, and I will follow up with an email with that link to all who have registered. Until next week, good health and God bless.